Okay, so are we at war officially or not? Has war been declared officially? No, not yet, I don't think. Look, we are in a very, you don't need me to say it, we are in a very risky, dangerous situation in which we find ourselves. Why are they taking us to war? It seems that this is something that we all have to be very aware of. Regardless of our own perspective, of our own ideology, whether we agree, disagree with what is happening, the outcome is going to be the same, that we might be at war. And so I'm going to recap within my mind how we got to this point. To begin with, let's start from the very beginning. How do we call the leaders of the world? The corporate elite, the corporations, the Western elite, I don't know which one calls it a different way, the powers that be. Okay, so the powers that control Europe and the US or the West, the fact is that I think they have been feeling threatened for a long time. It is not now. Since when have they been feeling threatened? I'm going to go back now. You're all aware of this, but I'm just going to recap. Okay, so since the end of the Cold War in the 90s, when the socialist and the communist regimes fell, the Soviet Union fell. And at that moment, the Western corporations, in some way, they felt that they were now the leaders or the owners of the world. And they say so, and they said so repeatedly, as a matter of fact. You remember those books, you know, The End of History and Fukuyama and all that. The fact was that they felt that from then on there was no opposition to them, basically. So to put it rather brutally, you know, we can do whatever we want, we have no opposition. The communist regimes have fallen, so they felt that they were in complete control of the West. They had the control of the Western media too. They had the control of public opinion. Why public opinion? Because basically from that moment on, if you think about it, political ideologies disappear. What do I mean they disappear? I know that perhaps you'll find this rather offensive, but I think in practice this is so. The words themselves haven't changed. In other words, we still speak of the right or the left or the center right or the center left and so on. But these are only words, really, because in practice they all align themselves from the 1990s within the same spectrum of, let us say, submission to the great financial interest of Western corporations. So the end of history, okay, this is Western liberalism has become really master of the world. It has no opposition. It can do pretty much whatever it wants in the world and in the West. And from a geopolitical point of view, there emerges what has been called the Wolfowitz Doctrine in the US and in the UK too, from the early 90s. It does say that the US, within that global corporate power, this Wolfowitz Doctrine says that really the US has the capacity and the means to control the world and must act in a manner consistent with that capacity. And that they have the right, it is written quite clearly really, and that it has the right to intervene in the countries that wherever they consider it appropriate or pertinent. And yes, we continue to have enemies, as it were. We have one enemy, perhaps two main enemies to subdue. The main one is Russia. And all this is said in 1992. And at the end of the 90s, they already had made that analysis in which they have also identified the threats that they have to deal with. So what are those threats? Okay, so we are in control of the world, but what we must do now is to continue to be in control in the 21st century. And here they identify a number of risks. They analyze those risks, and so they came up with the project for the new American century. This was the clearest writing about it. What were those threats? They obviously saw and detected that at the end of the 90s and beginning of this century, it's not only Russia and China as independent countries that they are not in control of those countries. These are large countries that we do need to control. And these countries have other cultures and the systems of government and so on, but they constitute now a potential threat to this world dominion. That is one threat. Another threat is the exhaustion of the economic model that we call now neoliberal, but it had been implemented since the 80s. You remember Thatcher and Reagan. And it is an economic model that is not working very well right now. The economy is not growing, it is increasingly indebted, also the demographic changes. It is not sustainable. And this is a clear danger for the elites who rely on this economic model functioning well, that works well. If it stops working altogether, their power might slowly disappear or be threatened. So the they have these countries which they do not control, threat number one, the exhaustion of the economic model that is not working very well, threat number two. And at the beginning of the century, also the third threat could be identified as the internet. These elites, remember, have already are in control, in any case, of all the major communication outlets. You remember there used to be so many newspapers, so many television channels, and so on, but they have all been, in the United States, they're all owned and controlled by 6 major corporations. You remember Le Monde in France was an independent paper with their own political, take. That's gone. It belongs to them, to the big corporations. You remember The Guardian, who was a center-left newspaper, and that's gone. It belongs to the same corporations. So these official outlets that we used to have on the center right, on the center left, in the center, and so on, they are now all controlled by the same powers. And so now comes the internet, and they see that they could be losing control little by little of the main take on what is happening in politics. Of course, at the beginning of the century, this was still a very small percentage of the population that was looking at these things, but they can anticipate what is coming. So against each of these threats, they actually developed strategies which at the end they didn't work, or they worked to a certain extent, but only partially, not entirely. They have obviously tried to, as we see, harass and surround and subdued Russia and China in many different ways, but they did not succeed on that. They have tried to control the internet, and they have succeeded up to a point with, certain degrees of censure and so on. But you could say that they have succeeded up to a point, but not quite, partially. And the economic model still doesn't work. It hasn't improved at all. Meanwhile, from the other side, Russia and China and emerging countries, through the BRICS, they have been growing in strength. Now, the BRICS have been there for a very, very long time. I remember when I was teaching business studies, well over 10 years ago, we were already talking about the BRICS. But in the last few years, they have taken this, they have grown, not only in number, but in influence and stature, it seems, in strength. And both politically and economic and militarily. And these countries aim at a multipolar world that is replacing the unipolar world of the Western corporations, under which we have been living up to now, where power is very much concentrated. If you like, from a political point of view in the US and Europe, in an economic way in, let's say, Wall Street and the City of London. So what happened in 2022 is that these strategies of more or less hidden confrontation with Russia and China in 2022 explode in the Ukraine conflict. Some are beginning to call it the Ukraine Project or Project Ukraine. And these elites now think that, well, finally, we have managed to get Russia to bite, to take the bait, as it were. So we'll start now that they have invaded. We can start implementing sanctions and sink their economy, regime change, and so on. So that's it. That is a clear path to victory now. So what happened? What happened was that Ukraine did not win the war, is not winning the war. Russia is winning the war. Some say has won the war, but in any case it is winning in a very clear way. They know this. And this has generated a panic situation, I think. In the face of this panic situation by these corporations. These elites have two options, or they had two options. Option number one, let us say, is to negotiate agreements with these other powers and reposition themselves in a multipolar world. That could have been, at least in theory, it could have been one option. In other words, okay, so Russia is going this way, Russia is going that way, the emerging companies are going that way. We have to reposition ourselves to keep the power that we have, and we will still be in this multipolar world a considerable power. They didn't choose that. So the second option is, no, we do not accept this multipolar world, and we have to continue to be this unipolar world, and that's it. And we don't accept anything else. And this second option obviously inevitably take us to war. That's it. Where else is it going to end? There is no other possible solution. So what type of war and where? But of course the war has already started, and there was a sort of a second Cold War. And what is happening now is that it seems that from a Cold War we are going directly into a hot war. And that hot war is increasingly closer. So the possibilities of direct confrontation between the two main powers, or three main powers, is something that is already on the table, so to speak. So why are they taking us to war? Well, as Gerald Celente says, he's an Italian-American, he says, when everything fails, they take you to war. Well, I think it's panic. Panic in the face of that situation. In the last few days, see what, for example, Macron increasingly is speaking of the death of Europe. In other words, Russia winning this war means the death of Europe. Other headlines: Europe in mortal danger. This is from newspapers in Europe. Europe will die if it does not create its own defense systems or defense army. Another headline is Macron to put French nuclear weapons at the service of European defense. Another one is Europe threatened. These are all headlines of the last few days. So, another one, NATO military already in Ukraine. The intelligence and training operations are already there. So they have been there for a very long time. We could argue that they have been there, the intelligence and the professionals and the experts have been there since the very beginning. But it seems as if they're making it official now. So this is something that has been going along, so Macron first said, perhaps we should be ready to put our own troops there. Oh, no, but they had already been there. So they are there, and then everyone talks about it, and then it seems as if just to make it palatable, as it were. And then little by little they move us along those lines. So now it seems as if they're trying to make it official what has been there all the time. In other words, no one country has said, the Prime Minister, the President has said, my fellow citizens, we are at war against Russia or against whoever. No, it just sort of more or less appears. They have been there from the beginning. They are acknowledging it now. They want to make it official. Each country now, with its own soldiers there, with its own flag, to fight Russia. Macron is proposing to do it openly. Tusk from Poland acknowledges that NATO soldiers are in the Ukraine. Chancellor Scholz from Germany calls for the mass production of weapons in Europe, wants to rearm Germany with compulsory military service again. Borrell says that Russia is the greatest existential risk for Europe. Ursula von der Leyen says that war in the Ukraine will mark forever the future of Europe. Metsola, the president of the European Parliament, says that Russia represents an existential threat to our union, the European Union. Okay, so there is a panic here, and the panic is evident to me. The issue is it Europe that is at risk, or is it the Western corporations system that is at risk here? The economy led by Wall Street and the city and so on. It seems to me that it is this corporation and this system that it is feeling that is an existential danger to them, not Europe. This is my opinion, not Europe or the European countries, but the existential threat is to them, to their system, to this international, to these corporations. This is so because after 30 years of trying to subdue Russia and to a lesser extent at the beginning China, but they were sure, as I said, that in the Ukraine, Russia, having fallen into the trap laid out to them, that this conflict was going to mean the final defeat and the regime change and so on, and that would mean by the failure of Russia, that would mean the defeat of that emerging multipolar world, and suddenly, more or less, they see that the opposite is happening and that Russia is winning the war. So the defeat before Russia is obviously to them totally unacceptable, because it means, contrary to what they had expected, that the political and ideological influence of Russia and of the emerging countries is now going, if they win, as they see that Russia is winning, that means that the geopolitical influence, especially also with emerging countries, is going to skyrocket. That is, it's no longer that this multipolar world is going to be there, that is the case. But that these countries and their anti-Western corporation stand, that is going to skyrocket. And also in many European countries, they are seeing that people are becoming more and more uncomfortable with this situation. This means that they might be losing control of dominance over the world. The control that they have been enjoying for a long time now, because they could, they could sanction any country, any little country. They have no way of complaining, really. So sanctions would be coming, if not worse things like bombings and regime change and so on. So in the medium term, they fear that they will lose control of Europe and the US, actually, due to mainly Russia anti-corporatist influence, and that of China as well, which is what fundamentally has united these two countries. The fact that both have developed strategies to remove large corporations from power in their own countries. We saw that Putin had already done this with the oligarchs. China has a system where they accept, public and private corporations, but the private corporations up to a point. In other words, they can do whatever they want, but they ultimately have to be in the service to China, not to just their own interests. So if their own interests were in conflict with China, or what the Communist Party sees as the what is of benefit to the nation, then they will have to actually subdue them. They cannot just do as Western corporations do, whatever they want in the country. So this is an existential threat indeed, but not necessarily to Europe, but to what now people call it monopoly capitalism, or corporate capitalism. So they have to avoid this. They're saying that we cannot continue to have this situation, and we have to avoid it at all costs. And they say that repeatedly. But the problem is that they don't know now how to avoid this situation. How do we stop it? So they are, as it were, in a wild goose chase. We're going to launch missiles into Russian territory. In an increasingly clear way, they're saying this. And no longer from the Ukraine necessarily with our soldiers, which was what was happening with our own military, but we're going now directly. We are going to send our troops directly. France is actually teasing other countries because it doesn't necessarily want to go it alone, and want other countries to join it. And that obviously means a direct war with Russia. They don't know what else to do. We're going to a world war. We are going to a European war with the risk of generating a nuclear war, or what? How do we do it? What do we do? What we cannot do is accept defeat. That is what they're telling themselves. Defeat is out of the question. So obviously once you take that stand, you have to go to war. Because accept defeat will mean to lose our power, or risk that they throw us out of complete control. And then what would happen then? Accept the risk of some of us being thrown in jail even for what we have been doing, or being prosecuted. So for them, obviously, this is unacceptable. So they are advancing on that world war, because they say, even if we don't win outright, it's the only thing we can do at the moment, it's the only thing we know how to do, it's the only thing we can think of. They have no other tool, so they are advancing in that direction with all kinds of measures. Threats on the one hand, acts of rearmaments, attacks on Russian territory, troop shipments, etc., etc. So, what is our stand in relation to all this? What do we do in the face of all this? Can a race to war, to a European war first, can this be stopped? Will they stop? Well, how could they possibly stop it? Well, two ways mainly. One could be, whether they want to accept it or not, fear of Russia's military might. You know what happened this week, that Putin and Lavrov said very, very plainly that if they do this, what they're saying, Macron is saying that they're going to do, and there is going to be a response. They're counting, you probably heard this many times, that they're counting on the fact that since they have crossed, the West has crossed so many red lines, as it were, and Russia did not necessarily react as they thought they might have done, that they can keep on crossing these red lines. But it seems that Putin has said, look, if you are going to do this in the way that you're suggesting now, we will retaliate. He said it very clearly. And he said, we will retaliate not necessarily just against Ukraine. We will retaliate directly, and that doesn't mean only directly onto your country, but directly on your, let's say, your interests in other parts of the world. So other parts of the world that are under, that belong to or are under the influence or the interests of, let's say, the US, the UK, many other countries, that they could actually retaliate on those. In other words, they are willing, I think that what Putin and Lavrov are saying is that we will not just concentrate on Ukraine. So that escalation is actually there. So he said it, there will be a response either directly to your own country or indirectly outside of Ukraine. They also said that they're starting training military exercises with tactical nuclear weapons, which are arms, technologically nuclear weapons, but with a sort of a reduced impact. But I don't know what that means exactly. It's a nuclear weapon, it's a nuclear weapon. So, well, let's see then how they position themselves in that sense. If, I mean, the West, if they see that Russia's reaction will actually defeat them there, and there is a possibility that they might, they might then reverse gears. We don't know. But this is moving so fast, the speed of weeks, days even. It seems that also they're a little bit afraid of all this happening before the US elections. And their idea to begin with is to have all these blow up during these months. But this could also be a break of stopping at the right time. In other words, if we are going to Europe, if the West, if it's going to go into this madness, let's say, with an expectation of 50-50 winning defeat, they might go for it. If it is only a 5% chance of the West winning, obviously perhaps that will tell them not to take that chance. So one is that they might calculate that, look, this we're going to lose. So perhaps let's think of doing it differently or doing something else. The other thing that they have to take into account is popular reaction. As to the winning or losing the military strength, there is nothing we can do much about, I suppose. But we can talk about this popular reaction, that it is certainly within people's control anyway. We can speculate at any rate. Now, about popular reaction is that this thing is going so fast that there isn't much time actually for a concentrated popular reaction. It takes a long time for popular reaction to coalesce or to organize. And the way things are going, I don't think we have the time for that. There is a problem with popular reaction too, and that, as I said at the very beginning, the extreme weakness of organized political opposition, because, as I said, since the 1990s, the different ideologies have been merging into one. In practice, they have disappeared, really. And if they haven't disappeared completely, if they haven't disappeared, these differences, they certainly are very hard to find. Right, left, center. In practice, what you're saying is that you are a left neoliberal, a right neoliberal, a center neoliberal. I know that this might be offensive, perhaps, but I think it's a reality. You can say 1,000 times, I'm on the left, I'm on the right, I'm whatever, but in practice, if you cannot do anything about it, and if you don't follow what your beliefs are, if you don't change anything when you're in power, then what you're doing is just following a neoliberal model, whatever you call yourself. So within that lack of organized political opposition in Europe, that theoretical opposition of what you call yourself is not capable of finding, of facing this type of situation. So it's not only that they are not capable or incapable of confronting this situation, but they don't even speak about it. They don't even mention these issues. To create a new organization or a new movement Again, the question of time. The existing organizations, be it political movements or political parties, for the most part, they are part of the system already. Okay, so they will fight and they'll hit one another on television, whatever, but that is probably to show how different they are when no difference exists, really. In any case, I think that to corporate power, their attitude is either submission or fear of punishment, blackmail. It could also be caution or prudence on their part. In other words, they can tell you, no, I don't agree with that, I agree with this, these are my beliefs, but as a practical matter, you see, I have to go along with the mainstream because I have to operate within certain lines, because if I cross those lines, punch, hey, there is no way to win an election that way. So in practice, it ends up being the same outcome, whether you agree or totally disagree. The practice is that you can do nothing about it, so the outcome is the same. In other words, you're working within a set of coordinates there, set up by the corporate power elite. So the result is always the same. So when confronting conflictive situations, nothing is done. In the last few years, we have seen the emergence of populist organizations, both on the conservative side and on the, how do they call themselves, the leftist side. But here we have to take another something else into account, and that is what is called now controlled dissidence. You can see that in many cases, for example, you will be allowed to disobey or to go against the mainstream in some issues, but never to go too far. You can actually, to a large extent, disagree with, for example, the Middle East war and take a different stand from what they want you to do, but eventually, but not with Europe, not with what is happening in Europe. So there is a suspicious tradition here. In the last decades, we have seen, especially, you can be, if you're on the left, for example, you can be, you can defend Venezuela and be against the United States there, or whatever, the same thing, the Cuba thing. You can even be, to a certain extent, you can even be pro-Palestine. But never against what is happening in Europe. And that is because I think people feel that it's easier to be in solidarity with something that is happening far away, but when it comes to your own backyard, as it were, when it touches you directly, they are not willing to go against it. So a lot of alternative organizations or movements, but there is no alternative proposed or analyzed. In the dissidence, for example. Let's talk a little bit about dissidence. I don't know whether I'm ranting a little bit here. There is, for example, a conservative, let's say, conservative anti-corporativism, conservative populism, for example. And on the left, also an anti-corporativism. Look, two examples. You have Hungary, okay, and the leading party, political party there is the Christian Democrats. It's on the center right, okay. The ideology is sort of populist Christian democracy. Since it is a Christian democracy, you can pile up adjectives against them as many as you want. They are principally against the capitalist model of recent decades. They are also against Atlanticism. That's a nice word. It means the Anglo world, the Anglo-American dominion model. And they are against the war. So some governments are standing out, and this has to be recognized. You also have the case of Slovakia. So this is a social democratic party. So you would, in old-fashioned terms, you would say center-left, okay? Here is social democracy ideology, but they are also against this, what they call post-capitalism. You had free trade capitalism. We have gone beyond that. Now is monopoly capitalism, corporate capitalism, or some say post-capitalism, okay? They are anti-corporativism, okay? Again, also, and this is on, you know, we saw on the center right and on the center left also against Atlanticism, the Anglo-American dominance. Some just call it globalism. That is what globalism is. And of course they're also against the war. We know what happened with the Prime Minister, yes, the attempted assassination. And this party is not as, it has less force than the party in power in Hungary, because the power in Hungary, they have won many elections, and these ones, Slovakia, they haven't been around for so long, so they're not. It's a much more recent government, so they're not so settled, as it were, not so consolidated after so many elections. And so with these two political parties of these two countries, the reaction from the media, which is owned by these corporations, it's insults basically. So how do we manage this? Well, we first have to be aware that the media is not the media that we all thought it was, before the 1990s. It's not that there were. It's just that before the 90s there were many other options. Now they're speaking with just one voice, all of them. So it's very clear, it's very evident. So we have to, be aware of that they are speaking for their owners, and analyze the realities, specifically. And I think we do have to stop relying on them as the interpreters of what is happening. They are working for their boss. And we have to, try to evaluate and think about our findings, whatever conclusions we have reached, without prejudice, but with a certain amount of prudence and caution about what they're saying. And especially with what we now call, control dissidence. What is this? What is control dissidence? Well, generally speaking, is the use of people's frustrations and anger in order to promote organizations or movements that, in fact, although they pretend to address that anger and that frustration, ends up working for or in favor of corporate power. Because many times corporate power will actually create a problem for you and then encourages a movement to address it, and then begins taking advantage of your reaction against that problem in their favor. You can think of many examples for this. This is nothing new at all. This has always been done. In fact, if you think about it, fascism and Nazism was a clear example of this in the 1930s. It started with the apparent objective that it was in order to those parties were to channel, let's say, social frustrations in Germany and in Italy. But the real objective at the time, if you think about it and you read that history, was to confront the threat of the labor movement and the Soviet Union, the threat that they represented for the large corporations at the time, for the empires of that time. You have to remember that in the 1930s, communism and communist parties were very, very strong. They really were. The Russian Revolution of 1917, it became romanticized. Yes, people didn't know at the time that it wasn't quite working. They didn't know of all what we learned afterwards. Not in the 20s and 30s. They were not really aware. So it was seen as, finally the workers had, a country where the workers ruled. That is how it was seen. And the communist parties were actually so strong that in many countries they got up to 40% of the vote. And this was a real threat to corporate power at the time, to the huge corporations. They had to do away with these parties. And all right, so and a lot of it was not only the Jews who were treated badly. I mean, the communists were arrested and suffered the same consequences. So this was a real issue in the 30s and 40s. So large corporations then were under an existential threat. They really thought that their whole existence was in danger, as they do now. And the danger was the working class rising, and the Soviet Union there actually, the Communist Party actually there in power as an example that it could be done. So, and then what did they do? Well, they see a situation of social frustration and anger, social, economic reasons, etc. And then they promote organizations and political parties that seem to be addressing these frustrations, but in reality they're taking advantage of that social frustration. Be aware of what is happening now, for example, with the Gaza, Israel and Gaza conflict. For a long time, I can see that these, for a long time, during the woke years, you remember, if a person from the Middle East committed a crime, you couldn't even say from where he was, or you couldn't mention the religion. It was always hush hush. Okay, but now, because a lot of people in the West are seeing what is happening in Gaza, I can see that an anti-Islamic thing is brewing. Okay, people are starting to think, oh, how many crimes are people of this faith committing? A few years ago, you couldn't even say it. And I think this is managed to counteract the pity that you might be feeling for their situation in Gaza. They are, in other words, working on what is important, but with the objective of benefiting ultimately large corporations. So this is a tool, and it was a tool then, and it's a tool very clear now, which is very easy to use for those who have the power and the money in the world. If you own and manage the media, you own and manage the financing of political parties, you can create new structures, new organizations to channel that type of frustrations. In other words, you create the contradictions, but then you manage the contradictions of your own system, the contradictions that your own system is creating. And that's easy. So in our time, we have crises of neoliberalism, of post-capitalism, and there are social contradictions created. We think of the gender wars and all that. An economy that is to divide and subdivide society. An economy that does not work, a demographic meltdown. There are a series of structural problems that generate a growing frustration in many countries. There is popular indignation about a lot of things. And so here we have a breeding ground for both real dissidence and controlled dissidence, for both things. Now, for it to be real dissidence, we have the problem that popular organizations, in the sense of those that are supposed to defend the interests of the people, many of them have been co-opted even though they started with the right motivation. Many of them end up being co-opted, and so by being co-opted, they act as a lid for political representation of citizens. And the problem is that nevertheless we're not aware of it, and we continue to trust these large organizations that actually take the majority of the votes, and people trust them. And this makes it difficult for other movements to emerge in the end. I'll give you a personal opinion. I remember in the 70s when many of these, or for example, Amnesty International, I don't know exactly when it was born, perhaps in the 60s, but I remember it being a very new organization. In the early 70s, when I was active politically and I was young, and I remember going to the demonstrations against the South African embassy, and we loved it, and sometimes we would spend the night there protesting outside, and would sleep there, and we would take our coffee, and we had a great time. Amnesty was genuine. It was, looking at countries around the world, but it's a personal opinion, but I think it has been co-opted now, and it's not that they don't report, but there are many that are not reported, and it seems clear to me that that is the case. And so these co-opted movements make it very difficult for real dissidence movements to emerge. You see, corporate power knows very well what the contradictions are. The contradictions existing in their own system, in their current system. And control dissidence is one of the key instruments that they have in order to control dissent, in order to control the situation. I have controlled it until now, generating those problems, and I'm also going to control it again through these controlled dissidence organizations. They are going to manage the frustration. How do we know? How can this control dissidence be managed? How do we detect if dissidence is controlled or not? If you have been active in politics for a while, you can almost smell it. You can see it quite clearly. If you haven't been involved, but there is an issue that you feel particularly strongly about, and you go out in demonstrations for the first time and you become involved, it might be more difficult to see it. But if you can't smell it right away, there was an incident, for example, this is reported quite openly, for example, the FBI in America. This is just an example. That they go and they pretend to be part of the people demonstrating and so on. That, okay? There was one particular incident where they probably called them, with not too much notice, and they said, okay, put on your MAGA uniform and go there, and they did, and they put on their MAGA hats, the red hats, and short pants, not short pants, knee pants, just t-shirts and so on, but they forgot to take off their socks. So so you could see clearly that they were feds. You know, they were wearing these clothes pretending to be ordinary people, but they forgot to take their socks off, and some even their shoes. That was obviously, they were called, you know, in an emergency, I suppose. But in the old days, we knew who they were too. It was clear. You were demonstrating about something, and there was always this guy with a camera. You could see it straight away. They moved differently. They dressed differently. They were not obviously that sophisticated. The ones that came to my demonstrations, obviously, they were not all that important. But they always had a camera. Now, within your group, you had a camera, but you knew the person who would take a photograph and then put it on, you know, on a pamphlet or something. But you normally knew the people. But all of a sudden, there was this person, this guy who looked so different, breathed differently. You could see right away. But anyway, this obviously is much more sophisticated now. So if you can't smell it immediately, look at how they are organized, okay? If you're talking about political parties, for example, is the strength coming from the base or not? Is the strength of this movement, of this organization, coming from a large base that they have, or is their power coming from financing? Okay. Mass parties are those that rely on a very large, very strong base. Yeah. And what the ones that are managed by a direct, an executive, as it were, a directorate, okay, normally have a weak base. They rely on an executive that brings in resources. They cannot survive by themselves, so you need financing. They cannot support themselves. Basically, their support, if it doesn't come from below, it comes from outside. And what is that outside? Media control by corporations, money from companies, etc., etc. If an organization is structured as a group of political cadres, let's say, leaders, or there is a certain room for distrust here. Distrust because if not at the first moment, in the second, if not in the first election, in the second, if not in the first whatever, in the second and certainly in the third, they will depend on those financing them, those external supports that end up always at the end being corporate support in most cases. They will be very quickly, if successful, controlled by corporate power, if they weren't so at the beginning. Another way of detecting controlled dissidence is their demagogic or the visceral position in the face of challenges, challenges to this post-capitalism. when there is general frustration in the people, in the populace, they will tend to manipulate those emotions and get them bigger and bigger and divide. If they are honest dissidents or real dissidents, they will see a problem and then they will want to solve it. Okay, so this is the problem. How do we solve it? What can we do about it? In other words, you try to find the solution. If you have been co-opted, if you're not real, you will tend to exaggerate the emotions in order to increase the divisions. This is also quite easy to see. So, what else do I have to say? Oh, my goodness. In small countries, if you are a small country and you are surrounded by bigger, more powerful countries, you know, you are squeezed there. Okay, you have to take your neighbors into account. You are not powerful, yeah. But also, so you have to go along with a lot of things, okay? But also, alternatively almost, if you try to do things differently from your neighbors, you have a problem with this neighbor in the east, this neighbor in the west. You have to be very careful because most likely a third party will come and say, I see that you have a problem. Well, you know, I wouldn't mind helping you out here. And third country, and these small countries always say, oh, great, yes, thanks. That is understandable, but watch out. I'm thinking of the Kurds, for example, okay? They're surrounded by what they consider their enemies, okay? Then the Israelis come along and the United States come along, will help you. And if you do this and that, and they ally themselves with them, okay? Let's see how the whole thing, the future with these alliances, what that will bring. One thing that we have to take into account is that political parties or politicians, once in power, abandon the ideology or the beliefs that they brought in, if not in the first year or the first election, certainly in the second election, because ultimately what they want is to win elections, and the tendency is almost inevitable, so they are going to be co-opted too. Anyway, it seems that at the moment they are taking us to war. No one has announced it officially, but that is where we are going. So this is something, to recap, this is something that started in the 1990s. Remember I told you in another video that Norman Mailer, the American writer, said that Bill Clinton had been the last president of the United States. That's in the 90s, okay? So it seems that the whole thing, the powers, the corporate powers that run the world, really, started with this Ukrainian project, that so far it has failed, and we in Europe and our governments, submissive as they are, they have no choice. They were already selected. But we, the people in Europe, are the ones who are going to be left holding back, or the baby. Let's see. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.